Pretty much talks between Cuba and the United States come to a standstill despite Cuba recently implement some free market measures. And, you know, I guess the United States didn't like that. Well, basically we have to circle back why United States is blocking Cuba and, all these sanctions in Cuba is because one, the United States doesn't want um Russia and China in its backyard because Cuba is around 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and we don't want communism and that type of government right in our backyard because Cuba have ties to Russia and they have ties to China in a way that influence their government. So that's the reason why United States is applying economical sanctions to Cuba. So Cuba is folding because the government of Cuba implements some free market reforms. Meaning free market reforms meaning they implement some reforms where they're taking out their hands out of the means of production of goods and services within the country. And they because everything in Cuba as it relates to the economy is run by the government, and it's not a free market there. It's a controlled market. The government controls prices of goods and services to a certain extent, but you know that's one of the that's one of the conditions America would like to change. So Cuba, let me read you guys something. Um, Cuba approved 176 economic measures, representing the biggest economic shift since the revolution, including more space for private businesses, free hiring of personnel, and authorization of private banks and investment by Cubans abroad. And yet, the U.S. responded with a new package of sanctions against Cuban President Miguel Diaz Canel and other officials. So, despite them trying to fold and implement free market measures and implement um, and taking government hands out of the ways and means of production, um, America still is not satisfied with what's going on, and they implement a few more sanctions. So this is the thing we got to understand is that Cuba and the United States have a long relationship, of sour relation, and it's all started when from the Cuban Revolution, and from that day until now, we have been sanctioning the hell out of Cuba, and now the latest rounds of sanction plus there's an oil embargo. So Cuba is actually running out of oil as we speak right now. And that's one thing the foreign minister announced that on July 7, a debate on the UN's, they're going to have a debate at the United Nations specifically over the US oil embargo. So I'm not sure if you guys noticed over the course of months and weeks, Cubans have been demonstrating because the country is out of oil. They have brownouts, they have blackouts, they have periods. They have periods of time where there's just no power because the Cuban power grid is run on oil and gas and petroleum products, and they used to get most of that from Venezuela, and Venezuela now is pretty much, you can say Venezuela is in U.S. control because the government there in Venezuela is pro United States, as we can assess that, and Cuba get all their oil and gas from Venezuela, and now it's cut off. You know, so the blockage of oil has caused further paralyzation to Cuba's economy. Um, you know, it's crazy. It is absolutely crazy because you know why? We have now come to the realization that gas and oil is the lifeline of any major economy. Even though we're trying to go green, go solar, go renewable energy, but deep down, gas and oil is the backbone, and Cuba doesn't have oil, doesn't have gas, and their economy is being paralyzed due to this fact. And it's a sad situation. But ultimately, though, what America wants is that Cuba um, start allowing people to come down there. When I say people, they should, implement a free market and just lose control over the economy. That's what America wants, over the government system, over the economy, and they want democracy down there. So they don't want any totalitarian government, any communist government. They want democracy down there. So that's what America is fighting for in their backyard, is democracy, because Cuba is 90 miles away from Florida. And when democracy is in your backyard, then your foreign adversary, like the Russians and the Chinese, they don't have such ways of means of government. They're not going to be attracted to come inside of Cuba. And you know basically democracy works with democracy, and China and Russia is not democracy, so they're not going to work with Cuba if Cuba become a democratic state in a way. So that's what America is trying to control. um, uh, you know over there in Cuba. But the pressure is on Cuba because let me read you something again. The oil blockage has further paralyzed Cuba's economy, leading to prolonged blackouts. Um, Fuel rationing, internet outage, and the suspension of public transportation and flight cancellation. Basic services such as garbage collection and water delivery have been suspended, and work days have been reduced. So you see the extent to the paralysis of the Cuban economy. So basically, all the functions and all the stuff that make the economy, all the things that make the economy function, are reduced or either suspended. Work week are shortened. Basic garbage services suspended at times. Internet blackouts. It's a whole lot, and it piggies back into my recent argument, is that oil and gas run the world economy, and any nation that doesn't have adequate oil and gas, they are in a bad state, and such is Cuba. You know, the Cubans are hurting. I understand that, and talks have suspended as we are now. I'm hearing, and what's next? That's the question. What's next? That's a big question. What's next? Is the government is going to totally decapitated and by the United States? When I said decapitated, I mean that is the government going to just fold by the pressure of the United States and just basically turn Cuba into a free market economy and a democratic state? We don't know that, but I think that's the ultimate goal of Trump, and that's the ultimate goal of this administration, to deter communism from this region, this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, our backyard, the United States backyard. So that's what it is. Um, but the Cubans are holding on, and they try to slowly move forward in the direction the United States want them to move forward, to move in. So let me read you something else. Rodriguez noted that while the conduct of the U.S. government officials was generally respectful during earlier talks, it is accompanied by constant aggressive statements against Cuba, threat of military aggression, and the imposition of additional coercive measures. Yeah, so basically he's saying that um, America is being passive aggressive. they talks with the American officials are being is in a state of passive aggressiveness, because you know in the front end they're being respectful, and but you know enclosed, after that they are showing aggression and making statements of of military operation, possible military operation. So that's sound to me like the U.S. officials who is spearheading this delegation with Cuba are being passive aggressive in a way, and it may be a way just to to intimidate them and know that America is a superpower in this region, and we can pretty much do whatever we like. You know, basically that's what I'm getting from it. Why the passive aggressiveness is being pushed. And basically America wants what America wants, and it's hard to as for a small country like Cuba to hold to hold any resistance to a certain extent. The only thing might save Cuba right now is if the administration change, and in the next 2.5 years or so, you know, and if the administration change in the next 2.5 years, and if the Democrats go in power, and they take their foot off the gas as it relates to how Cuba, as it relates to the Cuban situation, because mind you, both administration, Democrat and Republican over the years, put pressure on Cuba. These sanctions were in for years, for decades. However, sometimes the Democrats are not so hardline with Cuba. The sanctions are on, but they don't really pay them any attention. But on the contrary, this administration, the pressure is on, but at the same time, they paying attention to make sure that the pressure is on and the sanctions are biting. And the recent oil embargo is just an example of that, to show that the United States, this current administration in the United States, is applying pressure to Cuba and also ensuring that the pressure is working. And they told us, Trump told us before he got into office, that that's what his goal was. And I understand the United States position. They just want communism out of our backyard. They just want communism out of the Western Hemisphere, because this is our hemisphere. This is United States territory. We don't want China here. We don't want the Russians here. We don't want the Iranians here. And we don't want the North Koreans here. And those are the type of states Cuba aligned with, based on the Cuban government position, and based on how the Cuban government is formed and how Cuba is run. So that's what it is today for Cuba, guys. And hopefully we shall see what happens on July 7th, as Cuba, complains to the United Nations and about this oil embargo, because now the oil embargo is biting like crazy. It's been since January or February we took out Maduro, and ever since then Cuba haven't gotten any oil from Venezuela ever since in January or February. So all their reserves are done, all their reserves depleted. I think they're just running on fumes right now. And because they're running on fumes, the country economy is crippling, big time crippling. So it is sad, and the only thing might save them is, as I said, the government of Cuba just completely give up and submit to America's demand, and just change the economy overnight to a more, or not even overnight, but progressively show serious measures and show serious indication that they want to change how they operate the economy, and change it into a free market society, and democracy. So that's ultimately what the United States government wants.